tanked in the States, and we spent most of 1980 inactive. We didn't have a drummer anyway. The single Shandy was a hit abroad, however, and we booked a tour of Europe and Australia for the fall. But before we could play live, we needed a drummer. Auditioning people was very strange. We didn't want big-name drummers. We wanted somebody to come out of nowhere. It wouldn't have made sense to have Anton Fig or some other known commodity dress up as a black and silver giraffe or whatever. Bill placed a cryptic ad in some music magazines, and we also spread the word. Bill started to get tapes and photos and bios and lots of phone calls. He went through the materials, and we periodically invited groups of potential replacements he had filtered to audition with us. We decided we didn't want a drummer who played like Peter. The ones who made the best impression on us played what you might call English. They played on the backbeat, and whether they were playing double bass drums or not, they revered the same bands we did. Peter had enough trouble keeping time on a single bass drum and snare, so the idea of him playing two bass drums was out of the question. It wouldn't have made sense in the context of what we were doing anyway. Using a double bass drum in rock came about as a way to emulate what John Bonham of Led Zeppelin managed to do with one bass drum. His foot was so fast that it took most drummers two kick drums and both feet to mimic it. We didn't set out to find someone with a double kit, but we also didn't want to impose boundaries or limitations on a new member. As long as we were getting somebody new, we figured we should be willing to move forward. One guy who auditioned was a little stove repairman from Brooklyn named Paul Caravello. He was tiny with a huge head of hair and no airs or attitude. The first thing he did was ask us for our autographs. At first, I wasn't blown away by his playing, but everyone else in the room, including Vinnie Ponce and Bill Aucoin, thought he was great. We brought the guy back for a second time, and he turned out to have a good voice with the same raspy quality Peter had. He was also a quick learner. We had found our guy. Paul wanted to change his name, and we wanted him to change it too. We didn't need three Pauls in the band since Ace also shared that name. His first suggestion was Rusty Blades, which we vetoed quickly. Thankfully, the name game was short-lived when his second suggestion was Eric Carr, a name that sidestepped any obvious cartoon rock star moniker. He seemed like a good soul. Some of the other people who auditioned had acted like rock stars, thinking they would gain points for that. Eric was sweet. He eventually proved to be tortured in his own way, but he certainly was a much-needed breath of fresh air in the wake of Peter's departure. He had told us stories about repairing stoves, going to an apartment and opening up stoves to find all kinds of bugs and beasts crawling around inside. And we wanted him to know he wouldn't be a second-class citizen and KISS. So once we told him he was in the band, we did two things to welcome him. First, we bought him a silver Porsche 924. I somehow became the guy who was supposed to watch over him and groom him, teach him. He approached me after he got the car. "Can I have it painted camouflage?" "Absolutely not," I said. I didn't think he should take a sleek imported sports car and turn it into a circus mobile. Then I took him shopping at a place called the French Jeans Store. They sold, surprise, French jeans. I helped him pick out a new wardrobe. He'd need it since we were leaving for a European tour soon. It took some time to figure out a character for Eric. Heaven forbid we put him in a character people already knew. That seemed too obvious to us, and maybe sacrilegious. Originally, he was going to be the Hawk. We had a costume built with a protruding chest and feathers all over it. He painted a beak on his nose, but he looked like the mascot for a high school football team. All that was missing were the big foam chicken feet. It was horrible. Fortunately, he came up with the idea of the fox. He wore the same size boots as Peter, so we used existing boots and had the platforms built up even more. The boots ended up being like stilts, and he still looked tiny next to us. Eric got thrown in at the deep end of the pool. We had become comfortable dealing with the world we operated in. Basic stuff, like handling women's sexual advances and the media, or acting properly in a restaurant. Eric had to learn on the fly. The first night we were in Paris, Eric wore a brand new white suit to dinner, his first. Not 10 minutes into the night, he spilled a huge glass of red wine all over it. What a schmuck. He sent that suit to the cleaner so many times, hoping against hope the stain would come out, that when it finally came back white, the sleeves fell off when he put the jacket on. Another night, he really liked the food we'd had, which had come on a sizzling hot plate. "Please, sir, may I have some more?" The waiter brought another searing hot plate, carrying it with tongs, and Eric reached up and grabbed it with his bare hands. You could hear the tss sound as it singed his fingers. What a schmuck. Another night in France, a guy at a nightclub started hitting on Eric, making him uncomfortable. He went over to Ace and said, "That guy over there is trying to come on to me." Ace, in his inimitable logic, said, "Let's make out so he thinks we're together. Then he'll leave you alone." And the kissing began. Armed military personnel guarded the airports in some parts of Europe back then. One time, at an airport where security had AK-47s, Eric got pulled aside. He was wearing a camouflage jumpsuit and bullet belts. They took him through a door and out of our sight, but he was back surprisingly quickly. He seemed like a kid. His life experience had been limited, and he was naive and gullible. One night in England, he took a female journalist to his room from the hotel bar, where we were all hanging out. The next day, we asked him what happened. "Well, we talked, and then she wanted to take some pictures of me without my clothes on," he said. Sure enough, when the next week's issue of the Journalist magazine came out, there was Eric looking like an idiot, naked in the bathtub with his huge head of hair and a glass of champagne. What a schmuck. Every single night, the promoters threw parties which were packed with models and actresses. Some parties were women only. We would show up at a club or ballroom that had been taken over, and the place would be filled with beautiful women. Australia was one giant chicken coop. Eric, however, would often leave the parties and go out and befriend some waif he met on the street. He identified with the fans. Maybe he felt more like them than like one of us at that point. He sometimes brought girls to his room who had been camping outside trying to catch a glimpse of the band. For his comfort, he chose women like that over models and penthouse pets. Issues shape personalities. The first hints of Eric's trouble started to come out, too. One day, he rented a car and driver to spend a day in the countryside with a girl he'd met. He was so nervous, he told us, that he got awful gas and had to stop the car every 10 minutes to go to the bathroom. He was depressed afterwards about what an idiot he felt like. He also went on about how he was losing his hair. His hair was so big that when he moved forward, it moved backwards. It was always moving in the opposite direction from the rest of him. And yet he constantly wanted me to look at his head. "Look, is it thinning here?" And strangest of all, Eric struggled with the idea that he wasn't the original drummer of the band. I didn't understand it. I mean, of course he wasn't the original drummer. He was the second drummer. So what? There was no talking him out of his funk when he started obsessing over the fact that he would never be the first drummer. Back home, the band had more time off. Even though we hadn't toured in the States for a full year, we figured we'd make another record first. We decided to work with Bob Ezrin again, the producer who had served as our captain in Svengali for Destroyer. "Let's put out an album that makes a statement," he told us. "One that shows everybody how talented you are. Trying to show people how talented and bright you are is the best way to make an idiot of yourself, and we ended up doing that with flying colors." Gene, Eric, and I moved to Toronto in March 1981 to work on the album. Bob wanted to do it on his home turf. We didn't know at first, but his drug habit was now dictating his choice of location. I had always been aware that Bob had a drug problem, but he had managed it in the past.